I am Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, and I thought I knew who I was until last Christmas. The words still echo in my mind like a broken record playing the same devastating note over and over. My mother looked directly at me across our family's mahogany dining table, her voice cutting through the warm glow of Christmas lights and the scent of cinnamon candles, and said with chilling casualness, "You're adopted, Sarah. We never told you because we thought it would be easier this way." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fork I was holding clattered against my plate so loudly that everyone at the table turned to stare at me. 28 years of my life suddenly felt like a carefully constructed lie. To understand why that single sentence shattered my entire world, you need to know about the Mitchell family and the pedestal they placed me on my whole life. I grew up in Riverside, Oregon, in a sprawling Victorian house that my parents, Margaret and David Mitchell, had restored to perfection. Every room looked like it belonged in a home design magazine, with carefully curated antiques and family photographs spanning generations. What I didn't realize until that Christmas dinner was that none of those photographs actually contained my biological family. My earliest memories are filled with an overwhelming sense of being different, though I could never quite put my finger on why. While my parents both had dark hair and brown eyes, I was blonde with striking green eyes that seemed to come from nowhere in our family lineage. When I asked about it as a child, my mother would always laugh and say I got my looks from my great-grandmother on her side, a woman who had supposedly died before I was born. She would show me a faded photograph of a woman who, looking back now, bore absolutely no resemblance to me whatsoever. The Mitchell family had deep roots in Riverside, going back 4 generations. My father David worked as the town's most successful real estate developer, while my mother Margaret served on every charity board and social committee that would have her. They were the kind of couple who threw elaborate dinner parties and expected everything in their lives to appear perfect from the outside. I grew up understanding that image was everything, that maintaining the family reputation was paramount, and that any deviation from their expectations would bring shame upon the Mitchell name. From the time I could walk, I was enrolled in piano lessons, ballet classes, French tutoring, and every other activity that would mold me into the perfect Mitchell daughter. I excelled at everything they put me in, driven by an insatiable need to make them proud, and perhaps subconsciously, to prove I belonged in their world. My report cards were always straight A's, my piano recitals were flawless, and I never gave them a moment's trouble throughout my childhood and teenage years. Margaret had specific visions for how her daughter should turn out, and I molded myself to fit every single one of them. She wanted me to be cultured, so I learned 3 languages fluently. She wanted me to be accomplished, so I earned my master's degree in international business by age 24. She wanted me to marry well, so I dated only the sons of their country club friends and social circle acquaintances. Looking back, I realize I had never made a single major life decision that was truly my own. The pressure to be the perfect Mitchell daughter intensified after I graduated from college. Margaret would constantly make comments about my single status, dropping hints about which young men from prominent families might make suitable husbands. She had a particular obsession with matching me with Jonathan Whitmore, the son of her best friend and fellow charity board member. Jonathan was handsome enough, well-educated, and came from old money, but our conversations never went deeper than discussions about the weather or social events. Still, I dutifully attended dinner parties and charity galas where she would strategically seat us together, hoping romance would bloom. My father David, while less overtly controlling than my mother, had his own set of expectations. He assumed I would eventually join his real estate development firm and carry on the family business legacy. Every summer throughout college, he made me work as an intern in his office, learning every aspect of property development, construction management, and client relations. I was good at the work, perhaps even exceptional, but I never felt passionate about it. It was simply another way to meet the expectations placed upon me and maintain my position as the ideal Mitchell daughter. The strange thing about growing up adopted without knowing it is that you develop an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions and adjust your behavior accordingly. I became a master at sensing what my parents wanted from me and delivering exactly that. If my mother seemed stressed about a charity event, I would volunteer to help with every detail. If my father had a difficult client, I would stay late at the office to ensure everything was handled perfectly. My entire identity was built around being indispensable to them, around proving my worth through constant achievement and perfect behavior. Throughout my childhood and into my 20s, there were moments when I felt like an outsider looking in on my own life. Family gatherings often felt like performances where I played the role of the grateful daughter, the accomplished young woman, the pride and joy of the Mitchell family. But late at night, alone in my perfectly decorated bedroom, I would sometimes stare at my reflection in the antique mirror and wonder why I felt so disconnected from the life I was living. My relationship with my parents, particularly my mother, was complex in ways I couldn't articulate. There was love there, certainly, but it felt conditional, tied to my performance and achievements rather than unconditional acceptance of who I was as a person. Margaret's approval came in the form of public praise at social events or satisfied nods when I accomplished something noteworthy. Her affection was doled out like rewards for good behavior, and I learned to crave those moments of validation while simultaneously feeling hollow when they came. David was warmer in his own way, but his love also came with strings attached. He was proud of my business acumen and intelligence, often bragging to his colleagues about my achievements. But he never asked what I wanted out of life, or whether I found fulfillment in the path they had laid out for me. His attention was focused on molding me into his successor, rather than understanding me as an individual with my own dreams and desires. The social circle my parents moved in was tight-knit and insular, filled with families who had known each other for decades. I grew up alongside their children, attending the same private schools, summer camps, and social events. Yet even within this group, I often felt like I was observing from the outside, never quite fitting in despite my best efforts. The other children seemed to have an easy confidence about their place in the world that I envied but could never replicate. During my teenage years, I started experiencing what I now recognize as identity issues, though I had no framework for understanding them at the time. I would look at family photos and feel confused about where I fit into the Mitchell lineage. I would study my parents' faces, searching for resemblances that never materialized. When people commented on how different I looked from my parents, I learned to deflect with humor or change the subject, but their observations always left me feeling unsettled. My mother's explanations for my physical differences became more elaborate over the years. She would tell stories about distant relatives with blonde hair and green eyes, creating an intricate family mythology to explain my appearance. She had photographs of supposed great-aunts and long-dead cousins that she would produce whenever someone questioned my looks. These photos were always conveniently old and faded, making it impossible to verify any real resemblance. What I didn't realize was that Margaret was an expert at manipulation, capable of constructing elaborate lies with the same attention to detail she applied to her charity fundraisers. College provided my first real taste of independence, though even then I remained tethered to my parents' expectations. I attended Stanford University, their alma mater, and majored in international business because it aligned with their vision for my future. I lived in the dormitory they selected, joined the sororities they recommended, and dated young men they approved of. Even my rebellion was carefully contained within acceptable parameters. During my junior year at Stanford, I met Elena Vasquez, my roommate who came from a large, boisterous Mexican-American family in Los Angeles. Spending time with Elena's family during school breaks was a revelation for me. Their house was chaotic and loud, filled with multiple generations talking over each other, laughing, arguing, and showing affection in ways that felt completely foreign to my experience. Elena's mother would hug me the moment I walked through their door, treating me like another daughter without any expectation of performance or achievement. Watching Elena interact with her family made me realize how different my own family dynamics were. Elena could disagree with her parents, express frustration, even argue passionately about politics or life choices, and at the end of the day they would still embrace her with genuine love and acceptance. In my family, any deviation from expectations was met with disappointment, subtle criticism, or cold withdrawal of affection. I learned to avoid conflict at all costs, to present only the version of myself that would maintain their approval. After graduating from Stanford, I moved back to Riverside and took a position at my father's real estate development firm. On paper, my life looked perfect. I had my own apartment in the trendy downtown district, a successful career, and the respect of my parents' social circle. But privately, I felt trapped in a life that belonged to someone else. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of what my parents would think, what would maintain the family image, what would keep me in their good graces. My personal relationships suffered under the weight of these expectations. I dated a series of young men who were approved by my parents, but with whom I felt no genuine connection. These relationships followed the same pattern Margaret had modeled for me, focused on social compatibility and family status rather than emotional intimacy or shared values. I became expert at playing the role of the perfect girlfriend, the accomplished woman who would make an excellent wife, but I never learned how to be authentically myself with another person. The most serious of these relationships was with Michael Henderson, a successful attorney whose family had been friends with the Mitchells for years. Michael was everything my parents wanted for me: handsome, wealthy, well-connected, and ambitious. We dated for 2 years, attending countless social events together, and playing the part of the golden couple. Michael proposed to me at the country club's annual Christmas gala, getting down on one knee in front of hundreds of our family friends and acquaintances. I said yes because it was expected, because saying no would have created a scene and disappointed everyone who had invested in our relationship. But as I looked down at the enormous diamond ring on my finger, surrounded by applauding faces and well wishes, I felt nothing but panic. The engagement lasted 6 months before I finally found the courage to break it off, claiming I wasn't ready for marriage. The disappointment in my parents' eyes was devastating, but not as devastating as the thought of spending my life with someone I didn't love, living a life that wasn't really mine. Breaking off my engagement to Michael was the first major decision I made that went against my parents' wishes, and the fallout was swift and painful. Margaret barely spoke to me for weeks, communicating only through cold, clipped comments about my selfishness and inability to commit. David was more subtle in his disapproval, but I could feel his disappointment in every interaction. They had already started planning the wedding, had already envisioned their daughter married into another prominent Riverside family, and my decision shattered those plans. The aftermath of my broken engagement marked the beginning of a shift in my relationship with my parents. For the first time in my life, I had chosen my own path over their expectations, and while it felt terrifying, it also felt like the first authentic decision I had ever made. I started questioning other aspects of my life, wondering what else I might want to change if I found the courage. During this period of soul-searching, I began noticing things about my family that I had previously accepted without question. Margaret's need to control every aspect of our family image seemed more desperate than devoted. David's focus on legacy and family business felt more about his own ego than genuine care for my happiness. Their love, which I had always taken for granted, started to feel conditional and performative. I also started paying attention to things I had ignored throughout my childhood. The way my parents would exchange meaningful glances when certain topics came up. The way family medical history questions at doctor's appointments were always answered vaguely. The way certain photographs from my earliest years seemed to be missing from our family albums. The way my birth certificate was kept in a safety deposit box that I had never been allowed to access. One evening in late November, about 6 months after breaking my engagement, I was helping my mother organize family photographs for a charity auction display. As we sorted through decades of pictures, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. In every photo from my infancy, I looked different than I remembered looking in later childhood pictures. My hair was darker, my features were different, and I seemed smaller than I should have been for the dates written on the backs of the photographs. When I asked my mother about this discrepancy, she became flustered and started making excuses about different cameras and lighting conditions. But her reaction was so disproportionate to my innocent question that it planted a seed of doubt in my mind. That night, I called Elena, who had remained my closest friend since college, and described the strange interaction with my mother. Elena listened carefully, and then said something that changed everything. "Sarah, have you ever considered that there might be things about your family that you don't know?" She had always been more perceptive than I was about family dynamics, coming from a culture where emotional honesty was valued over image management. Her question forced me to confront possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying attention to details I had previously overlooked. The way my parents' closest friends would sometimes look at me with expressions I couldn't interpret. The way certain conversations would stop when I entered the room. The way my mother would become defensive when strangers commented on how different I looked from my parents. These observations accumulated like puzzle pieces, creating a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see clearly. The breakthrough came in early December when I was helping my father clean out his home office. He had asked me to organize files for his accountant, and while sorting through old tax documents, I discovered a folder labeled Legal Expenses 1995. Inside were receipts and correspondence related to adoption proceedings, including bills from a family law attorney who had handled what was clearly my adoption. I stared at those documents for what felt like hours, my hands shaking as I read through legal language that described the process of finalizing an adoption for a female infant.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The dates corresponded exactly with when I would have been placed with the Mitchell family. Everything suddenly made sense. The physical differences, the missing family medical history, the carefully constructed stories about distant relatives, the way I had always felt like I was performing the role of their daughter rather than simply being their daughter. My first instinct was to confront my parents immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the years of conditioning to avoid conflict, or maybe it was a deeper understanding that this confrontation would change everything between us forever. Instead, I spent the next few weeks in a strange state of limbo, knowing the truth but not yet ready to act on it. Christmas dinner seemed like an ordinary family gathering when it began. Margaret had, as usual, prepared an elaborate meal and set the dining room table with her finest china and crystal. David carved the prime rib while making small talk about his latest development project. We went through all the familiar rituals, exchanging gifts, taking photographs, playing the roles we had always played, but something was different in the atmosphere that evening. There was a tension I couldn't identify, a sense that secrets were pressing against the carefully maintained surface of our family harmony. Margaret seemed unusually anxious, checking her watch frequently and glancing at David with expressions I couldn't read. David appeared more serious than usual, as if he was preparing himself for something difficult. The conversation during dinner was strained, filled with the kind of polite small talk we might have with strangers rather than the easy familiarity of family. We discussed safe topics like the weather, local news, and upcoming social events, but underneath the surface pleasantries, I could feel something building like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. It was during dessert, as we were eating Margaret's famous chocolate trifle and sipping coffee from delicate porcelain cups, that my world exploded. I had just complimented my mother on the meal, and made some casual comment about family traditions when she set down her coffee cup with unusual force and looked directly at me. Her face was pale but determined, as if she had been building up courage for this moment throughout the entire evening. David stopped mid-sentence in whatever he was saying, and turned to look at her, clearly recognizing that something significant was about to happen. The Christmas lights twinkled cheerfully in the background, creating a surreal contrast to the gravity of the moment. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice steady but strangely distant, "there's something your father and I need to tell you. Something we should have told you a long time ago." She paused, glancing at David, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "You're adopted. We never told you because we thought it would be easier this way." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I had discovered the truth weeks earlier. Hearing her say it out loud, confirming what I had suspected, made it undeniably real. The fork I was holding clattered against my plate, the sound echoing in the sudden silence that filled the room. My parents stared at me expectantly, as if they thought this revelation would be met with gratitude or understanding. I managed to whisper, though the word came out strangled and barely audible. My throat felt tight, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it across the table. Margaret continued as if she hadn't noticed my shock, her voice taking on the same tone she used when organizing charity events or managing household staff. "We adopted you when you were 3 months old. Your biological mother was very young and couldn't care for you properly. We gave you a wonderful life, the best of everything. We thought it would be better if you never knew, if you could just be our daughter completely." The room seemed to tilt around me as 28 years of my life rearranged themselves into a completely different picture. Every interaction with my parents, every moment of feeling different or out of place, every carefully constructed explanation for my appearance suddenly made sense in the most devastating way possible. I had been living someone else's life, playing a role in a story where I was never meant to be the authentic protagonist. David cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, his expression attempting warmth but achieving only awkwardness. "Sarah, you have to understand, we love you just as much as if you were our biological daughter. More even, because we chose you. We wanted you so much that we went through all the legal processes to make you ours forever." His words, probably intended to be comforting, felt like salt in a wound I didn't even know I had. The idea that they had chosen me, that my entire identity was built on their decision rather than any natural connection, made me feel like a commodity rather than a daughter. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about my place in the world, had been based on a lie they had carefully maintained for nearly 3 decades. I don't remember excusing myself from the table or walking to my childhood bedroom upstairs. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the edge of my old twin bed, staring at the wall covered with academic achievement certificates and piano recital programs that now felt like props in someone else's life story. My hands were trembling so violently that I had to press them against my knees to make them stop. The sound of my parents' muffled voices drifted up from the dining room below, their conversation urgent but indecipherable through the hardwood floors. Everything in my room looked exactly the same as it had when I left for college 10 years ago. The pale yellow wallpaper with tiny rosebuds that Margaret had chosen when I was 12. The mahogany desk where I had spent countless hours perfecting homework assignments and scholarship applications. The bookshelf lined with classic literature that I had read not because I enjoyed it, but because it was expected of a well-educated Mitchell daughter. Now it all felt like a museum exhibit, dedicated to a person who had never really existed. My phone buzzed with a text message from Elena asking how Christmas dinner was going. I stared at the screen, unable to formulate any response that could possibly convey what had just happened. How do you tell someone that your entire life has been revealed to be an elaborate performance? That the family you thought was yours has been keeping the most fundamental truth about your existence secret for 28 years? I set the phone aside without responding, and walked to the antique mirror hanging above my dresser. The reflection staring back at me looked like a stranger. Those green eyes that had always seemed so unusual in the Mitchell family now felt like evidence of a completely different genetic heritage. The blonde hair that Margaret had spent years explaining through fabricated family stories suddenly represented unknown biological parents I had never been allowed to know existed. Even my facial structure, which I had never thought much about before, now seemed foreign and disconnected from the people downstairs who had raised me but were not actually my family. A soft knock on my bedroom door interrupted my spiraling thoughts. David's voice was gentle but uncertain. "Can we talk? Come in," I managed to say, though my voice sounded hollow and distant even to my own ears. David entered hesitantly, closing the door behind him with the careful consideration of someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. He had changed out of his formal Christmas dinner attire and into the casual sweater and slacks that made him look more like the father I remembered from childhood bedtime stories. But even that familiarity felt tainted now by the knowledge that those bedtime stories had been told by someone who was essentially a stranger who happened to raise me. "I know this is a lot to process," he began, settling into the reading chair by my window where he used to sit when I was sick as a child. "Your mother and I have been discussing whether to tell you for years. We kept waiting for the right time, but there never seemed to be one." "Years?" The word escaped me like an accusation. "You've been discussing this for years and decided to wait until I'm 28 to drop it on me during Christmas dinner." David flinched at the sharpness in my tone. Throughout my entire life, I had never spoken to either of my parents with anything resembling anger or confrontation. I had been the perfect accommodating daughter who absorbed their expectations and reflected back exactly what they wanted to see. This version of myself, raw and hurt and demanding answers, was as foreign to him as it was to me. "It seemed cruel to burden you with it when you were younger," he said carefully. You were so happy, so well adjusted. We gave you everything a child could want. We thought maybe it would never be necessary for you to know. Never be necessary. I stood up from the bed, pacing to the window and back. You thought it would never be necessary for me to know the truth about who I am, about where I came from, about my real parents. We are your real parents, David said firmly, though his voice carried a note of pleading. Biology doesn't define family, Sarah. We raised you, we loved you, we sacrificed for you. We are the ones who stayed up all night when you had pneumonia at age 7. We are the ones who cheered at every piano recital and graduation ceremony. That has to count for something. His words hit me with unexpected force, because they weren't entirely wrong. Margaret and David had been present for every milestone of my childhood and young adulthood. They had provided me with opportunities and advantages that many children never receive. But they had also created those experiences within the framework of a fundamental lie about my identity, and that deception now colored every memory with a sense of artificiality. It does count for something, I admitted, my anger temporarily giving way to a more complex mixture of emotions. But it doesn't erase the fact that you built my entire life on a lie. Every time I asked about family medical history, every time someone commented on how different I looked, every time I felt like I didn't quite belong anywhere. You knew exactly why, but chose to keep me in the dark. David was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. The adoption was handled through a private agency. Your biological mother was 17, unmarried, from a family that couldn't support another child. She specifically requested that the adoption be closed, that there be no future contact. We were told it would be better for everyone involved if you could start fresh, without the complications of divided loyalties or confusion about your identity. So you decided my identity for me. I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. You decided I should be Sarah Mitchell, the perfect daughter of successful parents, without ever asking what I might want to know about myself. You were 3 months old, Sarah. You couldn't make that decision for yourself. But I could have made it at 5, or 10 or 15, or any point in the last 28 years. Instead, you made it for me permanently by never telling me the truth. The conversation continued in this circular pattern for another hour, with David attempting to justify their decision and me struggling to articulate the depth of betrayal I felt. He kept returning to the theme that they had given me a good life, as if the quality of my upbringing should negate the fundamental dishonesty at its foundation. I kept trying to explain that the goodness of my childhood couldn't exist separately from the lie that had shaped every aspect of it. Eventually, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, and her makeup showing the first cracks I had ever seen in her composure. She had been crying, something I had witnessed maybe 3 times in my entire life, and her usual air of controlled sophistication had been replaced by something more vulnerable and desperate. "Sarah, please," she said, stepping into the room without waiting for invitation. "Don't let this change everything between us. You're still our daughter. This doesn't have to alter our relationship at all." The irony of her statement was almost overwhelming. She was asking me to pretend that learning the fundamental truth about my origins wouldn't change anything, essentially requesting that I participate in the same kind of denial and artificial harmony that had characterized our family dynamic my entire life. Even in this moment of crisis, she wanted to maintain the illusion of perfection, rather than deal with the messy reality of genuine emotions and honest communication. How can it not change everything? I asked, though my voice was becoming hoarse from the emotional exhaustion of the evening. Every conversation we've ever had about family, about heritage, about where I came from, was based on lies you told me. Every time I struggled with feeling different or out of place, you had answers that you knew weren't true. Margaret sat heavily in the chair across from David, looking older than I had ever seen her. "We thought we were protecting you." The social worker at the agency explained that children who grow up knowing they're adopted sometimes struggle with feelings of rejection and abandonment. "We wanted to spare you that pain. Instead, you gave me 28 years of feeling like I was performing in a play where everyone else knew the script except me," I replied. "Do you have any idea what it's like to spend your whole life trying to figure out why you don't feel like you truly belong anywhere, only to discover that your instincts were right all along?" The 3 of us sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of nearly 3 decades of deception settling over the room like dust. Outside my bedroom window, I could see the neighborhood where I had grown up, the tree-lined streets and elegant houses that had formed the backdrop of my childhood. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, but my relationship to it had been fundamentally altered. This wasn't really my hometown anymore. These weren't really my family traditions or my ancestral home. I was a visitor in a life I had thought belonged to me. Margaret finally broke the silence. "What do you want from us now, Sarah? What can we do to fix this?" The question revealed how little she understood about what had happened. There was no quick fix for discovering that your entire identity had been constructed around a lie. There was no way to undo 28 years of conditioning and false narratives. The damage wasn't something that could be repaired with an apology or an explanation of good intentions. "I want information," I said finally. "I want to know everything you know about my biological parents. I want to see all the adoption records. I want to understand why this decision was made and what my options are now for learning about my real family." Both of my parents exchanged a look that I had seen countless times throughout my childhood, but was only now beginning to interpret correctly. It was the look of two people who shared secrets and had to decide how much truth they were willing to reveal. That expression, which I had previously assumed was just normal parental communication, now seemed loaded with decades of careful information management. "The adoption was closed," David repeated. "The records are sealed. Your biological mother specifically requested no future contact." "That was 28 years ago," I countered. "People change their minds. Circumstances change. I'm an adult now, and I have the right to at least try to learn about where I came from." Margaret's composure cracked further. "What if you find them and they don't want a relationship with you? What if learning about them just causes you more pain? We've given you a stable, loving family. Why risk destroying that for people who gave you away?" Her words revealed the depth of her fear and insecurity about my adoption in ways that were both heartbreaking and infuriating. She was terrified that if I found my biological family, I would somehow love her less, or discover that they could offer me something she couldn't. But she was also revealing that she had never truly understood that I might have a legitimate need to know about my origins that had nothing to do with rejecting her or David. "Because they didn't give me away," I said, feeling clarity about something for the first time since dinner began. "They made an impossible decision when they were probably scared and alone, and thought they were doing what was best for me. That doesn't make them villains, and it doesn't mean I can't love all of you. But I need to know who I am, not just who you wanted me to be." The conversation that followed was the most honest exchange we had ever had as a family, but it was also painful in ways that I hadn't anticipated. David admitted that he had always feared this day would come, that some part of him had been preparing for the possibility that I would eventually want to search for my biological family. Margaret confessed that she had sometimes felt guilty about keeping the secret, especially during my teenage years when I had struggled with questions about identity and belonging. They told me what little they knew about my biological parents. My birth mother had been a 17-year-old high school student named Jennifer Collins who had hidden her pregnancy from her family for 6 months. When her parents finally discovered the situation, they had contacted a private adoption agency because they felt they couldn't afford to support another child, and believed that Jennifer was too young to raise a baby on her own. The biological father was also 17, a boy named Ryan Torres, who had been Jennifer's boyfriend but whose family had moved away when they learned about the pregnancy. The adoption had been facilitated by Riverside Family Services, an agency that no longer existed under that name but had been absorbed by a larger organization called Pacific Northwest Adoptions. Margaret had kept all of the original paperwork in a safety deposit box, though she had never mentioned its existence to me. The documentation included my original birth certificate listing Jennifer Collins as my mother and Ryan Torres as my father, as well as non-identifying information about both of their families. Learning these basic facts about my origins felt simultaneously overwhelming and insufficient. Jennifer Collins and Ryan Torres. Those names belonged to two teenagers who had created me and then made the difficult decision to place me with another family. They were real people with their own stories and struggles, not the shadowy figures I had imagined during the few times I had allowed myself to wonder about my biological parents. But they were also complete strangers whose lives had intersected with mine, for only the briefest moment before diverging onto completely different paths. Do you know what happened to them after the adoption? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be disappointing. The agency told us that Jennifer planned to finish high school and had been accepted to community college. Margaret said carefully. Ryan's family had moved to California, but we don't know what he did after that. The whole point of a closed adoption was that there would be no ongoing contact or information sharing. But it's been 28 years, I pressed. They're adults now with their own lives. Maybe they've wondered about me, maybe they would want to know that I turned out okay. David leaned forward in his chair. Sarah, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that they might not want contact. Building up expectations could lead to devastating disappointment. His concern was probably genuine, but it also felt patronizing in a way that reflected our entire relationship dynamic. Throughout my life, Margaret and David had positioned themselves as the experts on what was best for me, making decisions about my welfare without necessarily consulting my own feelings or desires. Now they were trying to protect me from potential disappointment by discouraging me from pursuing something that felt essential to my sense of self. I understand that, I replied. But the disappointment of being rejected by people I've never known can't be worse than spending the rest of my life wondering about them. At least if I try to find them, I'll know I made my own choice about my identity instead of having it decided for me. The conversation continued late into the evening, with my parents alternating between attempts to dissuade me from searching for my biological family and reluctant offers to help with the process. By the time we finally said goodnight, nothing had been resolved, but the fundamental dynamic of our relationship had shifted permanently. I was no longer the compliant daughter who accepted their version of reality without question. They were no longer the all-knowing parents whose authority I accepted without challenge. I spent that night lying awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. The room felt like a museum dedicated to a person who had never really existed, filled with artifacts of a childhood that had been built on a foundation of carefully maintained lies. Every trophy and certificate on my walls represented achievements I had earned while believing myself to be someone I wasn't. Every photograph on my dresser showed moments of happiness and connection that had been real but were now complicated by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath the surface. The next morning, I called Elena before my parents woke up, needing to talk to someone who wasn't invested in maintaining family harmony at the expense of honesty. Elena listened without interruption as I told her everything that had happened, from the Christmas dinner revelation to the long conversation with my parents that had followed. "How are you feeling about all of this?" she asked when I finished, her voice gentle but direct in the way that had made her such a valuable friend throughout the years. "Honestly, I feel like I'm grieving," I admitted. "I'm grieving the person I thought I was, the family history I thought I had, the sense of belonging I thought was real. But I'm also angry that I'm having to grieve these things at 28 instead of having been given the chance to build my identity around the truth from the beginning." "That makes complete sense," Elena said. "Your parents might have had good intentions, but they robbed you of the chance to know yourself authentically. That's a legitimate loss." Her validation meant more to me than I could express. Throughout the conversation with Margaret and David, I had started to doubt whether my feelings were reasonable or if I was being ungrateful and dramatic. Elena's perspective helped me trust my own emotional response to what had happened. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "I think I need to try to find them," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I need to know who Jennifer Collins and Ryan Torres became. I need to understand where I came from, even if they don't want a relationship with me." "I think that's brave," Elena replied. "And I think it's the right choice for you, regardless of how it turns out." After hanging up with Elena, I spent the morning researching private investigators and adoption search services online. The internet had made finding people significantly easier than it would have been when I was younger, but it was still a complex process that could take months or even years to complete successfully. Professional search services specialized in adoption cases could navigate the legal and practical challenges more efficiently than I could on my own. When I came downstairs for breakfast, I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee that had clearly been growing cold while they waited for me. Margaret's eyes were red from crying, and David looked like he hadn't slept at all. The cheerful Christmas decorations throughout the house seemed wildly inappropriate for the somber atmosphere that had settled over our family. "We've been talking," Margaret said before I could pour myself coffee. "If you're determined to search for your biological parents, we want to help you do it safely and properly." The offer surprised me, though I realized it probably shouldn't have. Margaret's need to control situations extended even to circumstances that were fundamentally beyond her influence. If I was going to search for my biological family, she wanted to manage the process rather than risk me doing something that might reflect poorly on her or create complications she couldn't anticipate. "What kind of help?" I asked, cautiously. David pulled out a folder that I recognized as the one he had been keeping locked in his desk drawer throughout my childhood. "All of the adoption documentation," he said. "The original birth certificate, the agency records, the legal paperwork, everything we have that might be useful for a search." I took the folder with hands that were steadier than I had expected them to be. Opening it felt like crossing a threshold into a different version of my life, one where I would actively pursue the truth about my origins instead of accepting the carefully constructed narrative my parents had provided. The first document was my original birth certificate, listing my name as Sarah Elizabeth Collins and identifying Jennifer Marie Collins as my mother and Ryan Michael Torres as my father. Seeing my biological parents' names on an official document made them feel more real than they had during our conversation the night before. Jennifer Marie Collins had been 17 years old when she gave birth to me at Riverside General Hospital on March 15, 1995. Ryan Michael Torres had been 18 and listed his occupation as student. These weren't just names anymore, but legal identities connected to real people who had made a decision that had shaped the entire trajectory of my life. "There's also this," Margaret said hesitantly, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Jennifer wrote you a letter when you were born. The social worker gave it to us to keep until you were 18, in case you ever wanted to read it. We've been carrying it around in the safety deposit box for 10 years, never sure if or when to give it to you." The envelope was yellowed with age and felt fragile in my hands. My name was written across the front in handwriting that looked young and uncertain. Inside was a single page of notebook paper covered with the same careful script, as if someone had written and rewritten the words multiple times before settling on the final version. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, and I had to stop reading for a moment because seeing my name in my birth mother's handwriting felt overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I hope that someday you'll understand that giving you to another family was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I believe it's the best thing I can do for you. I'm 17 years old and still in high school. Ryan is 18 and planning to join the military after graduation. We're both too young and too scared to give you the life you deserve." The letter continued for several paragraphs, with Jennifer describing her hopes for my future and her gratitude to the family who would raise me. She wrote about wanting me to have opportunities and stability that she couldn't provide, about believing that love sometimes meant letting go, about hoping that I would grow up knowing I was wanted even though she couldn't keep me. The final paragraph was the most emotional. "I hope you'll think of me sometimes and know that not a day will go by that I don't wonder about you and pray that you're happy. You will always be in my heart even though I can't be in your life. Love always, Jennifer." Reading those words felt like having a conversation with someone who had been waiting 28 years to talk to me. Jennifer's voice came through clearly in her writing, young but thoughtful, scared but determined to do what she believed was right. She wasn't the heartless person who had abandoned me that I had sometimes imagined during my darker moments of self-doubt. She was a teenager who had found herself in an impossible situation and had tried to make the most loving choice she could manage. "She sounds like she really cared about you," David said quietly, watching my face as I finished reading the letter. "She did," I agreed, carefully folding the letter and placing it back in its envelope. "And that makes me want to find her even more. I want her to know that her hopes for me came true, that I did grow up happy and successful and loved. She deserves to know that her sacrifice wasn't in vain." Margaret was crying again, but these tears seemed different from the ones she had shed the night before. "I've been so afraid that if you found her, you would love us less," she admitted. "But reading that letter again, I realized that she loved you enough to want you to have parents who could give you everything. In a way, we're all on the same side." That insight felt like the first step toward a healthier understanding of how my adoption could be integrated into our family story. Instead of viewing Jennifer and Ryan as threats to my relationship with Margaret and David, I could see them as people who had made it possible for me to have the parents who raised me. My biological family and my adoptive family didn't have to be in competition with each other in my heart or my life. Over the following weeks, Margaret, David, and I worked together to hire a professional search service specializing in adoption cases. The investigator, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who had been reuniting families for 15 years, explained that the process could take anywhere from a few weeks to several months depending on how much the people we were searching for had moved around and whether they had changed their names through marriage or other circumstances. Rebecca began by searching public records for any trace of Jennifer Collins and Ryan Torres, starting with their last known addresses and expanding outward through school records, employment history, marriage licenses, and property ownership. The initial search revealed that Jennifer had graduated from Riverside High School 6 months after my birth and had attended community college for 2 years before transferring to Oregon State University, where she had earned a degree in elementary education. Ryan had indeed joined the military, as Jennifer had mentioned in her letter, serving 4 years in the Army before settling in Sacramento, California. The most promising lead came from Rebecca's discovery that Jennifer had married someone named David Kim in 2003 and had been living in Portland under the name Jennifer Collins Kim. She was working as a 4th-grade teacher at a school in the Beaverton district and appeared to have 2 other children, both school-aged. Ryan had married as well and was working as an electrician in Sacramento, with 3 children of his own. Learning these basic facts about their adult lives felt surreal. Jennifer and Ryan had moved on from the decision they had made about me and built families of their own. They had other children who were technically my half-siblings, people who shared my genetic heritage but had grown up in completely different circumstances. I wondered whether Jennifer's children knew about me, whether she had ever told them about the daughter she had placed for adoption before they were born. Rebecca's next step was to make contact, but she approached this phase with careful consideration for everyone involved. Rather than showing up unannounced or making phone calls that could be shocking or disruptive, she sent carefully worded letters to both Jennifer and Ryan explaining that their biological daughter was interested in making contact if they were open to it. The letters emphasized that there was no pressure for them to respond and that all communication could be facilitated through Rebecca's office to protect everyone's privacy. The waiting period after those letters were sent was excruciating. I found myself checking my email constantly and jumping every time my phone rang, hoping for news from Rebecca, but also terrified of what that news might be. Margaret and David were supportive during this period, in ways that surprised me, asking regularly about any updates and offering emotional support when the uncertainty became overwhelming. 3 weeks after the letters were sent, Rebecca called with an update. Jennifer had responded within days, expressing excitement about the possibility of contact and providing her phone number for direct communication. Ryan had also responded positively but requested that initial contact be limited to email, as he wanted to discuss the situation with his wife before proceeding further. "Jennifer sounds eager to talk to you," Rebecca explained. "She mentioned in her letter that she has thought about you every day since the adoption and has always hoped that you might want to find her someday. She included several pages of information about her life and asked me to tell you that she has kept March 15th as a special day every year, lighting a candle and wondering what you were doing on your birthday." The image of Jennifer lighting a birthday candle for me every year for 28 years was almost too emotional to process. She had created her own private ritual to maintain a connection with me, even though she had no idea where I was or how I was doing. The dedication and consistency of that gesture revealed a depth of ongoing love that I hadn't dared to hope for. "What did she want to know about me?" I asked. "Everything," Rebecca replied with a smile in her voice. "She asked about your health, your education, your career, whether you were happy, whether your adoptive parents had treated you well. She wanted to know if you looked like her or Ryan, what your personality was like, what your interests were. Basically, she wanted to catch up on 28 years of your life." That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at Jennifer's phone number written on a piece of paper, trying to work up the courage to make the call that would change my life forever. After nearly 3 decades of wondering about my biological mother, I was about to have a conversation with her. The reality felt both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious but hopeful. Hello, Jennifer. My voice came out as barely a whisper. This is Sarah Collins. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt like an eternity. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like muffled crying. Oh my God, Sarah, I can't believe it's really you. Her voice was warm and melodic, with a slight Oregon accent that reminded me of my college friends from rural areas. She sounded older than I had expected, but still carried traces of the young woman who had written that letter 28 years ago. Hearing her speak my name with such emotion made me feel recognized in a way I had never experienced before. I got your information from Rebecca Chen, I managed to say, my hands shaking as I held the phone. She said you wanted to talk. I've wanted to talk to you every day for 28 years, Jennifer replied, her voice thick with tears. I used to imagine what your voice would sound like when you grew up. I wondered if you'd sound like me or your father, or completely different. You sound beautiful. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours. Jennifer told me about her life since the adoption, how she had finished high school while dealing with the grief of giving me up, how she had struggled through her early college years with depression and guilt over her decision. She had met her husband David Kim during her student teaching semester, and they had married when she was 25. Her 2 children, Michael and Emma, were now 15 and 13 respectively. Do they know about me? I asked. They do, Jennifer said softly. I told them when Michael turned 10 because I didn't want them to find out accidentally someday. I explained that I had a daughter before I met their father, and that I had made the difficult decision to place her with a family who could give her opportunities I couldn't provide at 17. They've always known they have an older sister somewhere in the world. The idea that I had siblings who had grown up knowing about me while I remained unaware of their existence was both touching and jarring. Jennifer had been honest with her children in ways that Margaret and David had never been with me, trusting them with the truth rather than constructing elaborate deceptions to protect them from complicated realities. Jennifer asked dozens of questions about my life, wanting to know everything from my favorite foods to my career aspirations. She cried when I told her about my education and professional success, saying she had always wondered whether I had been given the opportunities she had hoped for when she made the adoption plan. She laughed when I described my personality traits and interests, pointing out similarities to both herself and Ryan. You get your stubbornness from him, she said with obvious affection when I mentioned my tendency to research everything thoroughly before making decisions. And your love of reading definitely comes from my side of the family. My mother was a librarian for 30 years. Learning about my genetic heritage felt like solving a puzzle I had been working on my entire life without realizing it. Suddenly my inexplicable love of classical music made sense because Jennifer played piano and had majored in music before switching to education. My tendency toward perfectionism and high achievement reflected traits that ran in both biological families. Even my preference for small social gatherings over large parties aligned with the introversion that Jennifer described as a family characteristic. What about Ryan? I asked eventually. Rebecca said he responded to her letter too. Jennifer's voice became more careful. Ryan was thrilled to hear from you, but he's being cautious about the contact because his wife doesn't know about the adoption. He got married young to someone he met in the military, and he never told her about our relationship or about you. He's worried that sudden contact from a daughter she doesn't know exists could create problems in his marriage. The revelation that Ryan had kept my existence secret from his wife added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. I understood his position intellectually, but it stung to know that one of my biological parents had built his adult life around pretending I didn't exist. It felt like another form of rejection, even though I knew his motivations were probably more about protecting his current family than rejecting me personally. I'd still like to communicate with him somehow, I said, even if it has to be through email or letters. I want him to know that I don't blame him for the adoption decision and that I turned out okay. I'll talk to him, Jennifer promised. He's a good man, Sarah.
The situation we found ourselves in at 17 wasn't anyone's fault, and he's never stopped caring about what happened to you. He just needs time to figure out how to handle this with his family. As our conversation continued,
Jennifer shared details about my extended biological family that helped fill in gaps I had never known existed. My maternal grandmother, the librarian, was still alive at 72 and living in a retirement community in Eugene. I had 3 aunts and 2 uncles on Jennifer's side, along with numerous cousins scattered across the Pacific Northwest. Ryan's family was originally from Mexico, which explained my naturally tan complexion and dark eyebrows that had always seemed inconsistent with my blonde hair. Your grandmother has always wondered about you, Jennifer said. She supported my decision to place you for adoption, but she's kept a photo of you as a baby in her wallet all these years. She would be overjoyed to meet you if you're interested. The idea of having a living grandmother who had carried my baby picture for nearly 3 decades was almost overwhelming. Throughout my childhood, I had envied friends who had close relationships with their grandparents, not realizing that I actually had biological grandparents who might have wanted to know me if they had been given the opportunity. I'd love to meet her, I said, meaning it completely. I'd love to meet all of them if they're interested. They will be, Jennifer assured me. My whole family has wondered about you over the years. You have cousins who are close to your age, who would probably love to get to know you. By the time we finally hung up, we had made tentative plans for me to visit Portland the following weekend to meet Jennifer and her family in person. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. I had spent 28 years wondering about my biological mother, and now I was going to sit across from her at a dinner table and try to bridge the gap of nearly 3 decades. The week leading up to my visit to Portland passed in a blur of nervous energy and careful preparation. I found myself obsessing over what to wear, what gifts to bring, how to act around Jennifer's children who were technically my half-siblings. Margaret was surprisingly supportive during this period, helping me choose appropriate gifts and offering advice about meeting estranged family members based on her experience with social situations. Remember that they're probably just as nervous as you are, she said the night before my trip. Jennifer has spent 28 years wondering if she made the right decision. Meeting you will be emotional for her too. David offered to drive me to Portland, but I declined, needing the 2-hour drive to collect my thoughts and prepare mentally for what promised to be an intense experience. The drive through the Oregon countryside gave me time to reflect on how much my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, I had thought I knew who I was and where I came from. Now I was driving to meet a family I had never known existed. Jennifer's house was a modest 2-story colonial in a middle-class neighborhood, filled with mature trees and well-maintained yards. She opened the front door before I could knock, having been watching for my car from the living room window. Seeing her in person for the first time was like looking at a version of myself, aged 20 years into the future. We had the same bone structure, the same green eyes, even similar mannerisms in how we carried ourselves. "Sarah," she said, her voice breaking as she reached out to hug me. "You're so beautiful. You look exactly like I imagined you would." The embrace felt natural despite the strangeness of the situation. Jennifer was shorter than me, by several inches, but had the same slight build and delicate features. Her hair was darker blonde than mine, streaked with silver that made her look distinguished rather than old. She had laugh lines around her eyes and a warmth to her expression that immediately put me at ease. Her husband David Kim was waiting in the living room, a kind-faced man with graying temples who stood to shake my hand with obvious nervousness. "Thank you for wanting to meet us," he said sincerely. "Jennifer has talked about you every March 15th, for as long as I've known her. This means everything to her." Michael and Emma, my half-siblings, were more reserved but clearly curious. Michael, 15, had inherited his father's Korean features but had Jennifer's green eyes. Emma, 13, looked more like Jennifer, but with darker hair and a shyness that reminded me of myself at that age. They had prepared questions about my life and interests, wanting to know about their older sister, who had been a theoretical person until today. The afternoon passed more easily than I had anticipated. We looked through photo albums spanning Jennifer's life since the adoption, and she showed me pictures of her college graduation, wedding, and her children's milestones. She had kept the hospital bracelet from when I was born, along with the only photograph she had of me as an infant, taken just before I was placed with Margaret and David. "I used to stare at this picture and try to imagine what you would look like when you grew up," she said, showing me the faded Polaroid. "I wondered if you would have my nose or Ryan's eyes, whether you would be tall or short, what your personality would be like." Jennifer's children warmed up to me gradually throughout the day, asking about my job and my life in Riverside. Emma was particularly interested in my educational achievements, having inherited the family's academic focus. Michael wanted to know about my relationship with my adoptive parents and whether I had always known I was adopted. I just found out at Christmas, I explained, which prompted a long conversation about secrets and family dynamics. Jennifer's children had grown up in a household where difficult topics were discussed openly and honestly, giving them a maturity about complex family situations that I envied. "Were you angry when you found out?" Emma asked with the directness that only teenagers possess. "I was hurt more than angry," I replied truthfully. I felt like I had been living someone else's life without knowing it. But I'm grateful that it led me to all of you. During dinner, Jennifer shared more details about the circumstances surrounding my birth and adoption. She had been a junior in high school, planning to attend college on an academic scholarship, when she discovered she was pregnant. Ryan had been her first serious boyfriend, and they had talked about marriage after graduation. But when the pregnancy was discovered, both families had pressured them toward adoption, arguing that they were too young to provide properly for a child. "The hardest part wasn't giving birth to you," Jennifer said, her voice becoming emotional. "The hardest part was the 3 days in the hospital afterward when I got to hold you and feed you, knowing that I would have to say goodbye. The social worker kept encouraging me to bond with you, saying it would be healthy for both of us, but it made letting go almost impossible." She described the adoption ceremony at the courthouse, where Margaret and David had been waiting to take me home. Jennifer had insisted on being present to meet my adoptive parents and to hand me over personally, rather than having the transfer handled by social workers. She had asked Margaret and David to promise they would tell me I was loved and wanted, even though I couldn't stay with my birth family. "They seemed like wonderful people," Jennifer said. "They were so grateful and so eager to love you. Margaret cried when she held you for the first time, and David promised me they would give you every opportunity in the world. I felt like I was making the right choice, even though it was breaking my heart." Hearing Jennifer's perspective on the adoption helped me understand Margaret and David's behavior in a new light. They had received me from a teenager who was sacrificing her own dreams to give me a better life, and they had probably felt enormous pressure to live up to the promises they had made to her. Their perfectionism and high expectations might have been motivated by a genuine desire to honor Jennifer's sacrifice by raising me to be everything she had hoped I would become. As the evening progressed, Jennifer showed me letters she had written to me over the years but had never sent. There were birthday cards for every year of my life, Christmas cards, congratulations cards for graduations she had imagined, and encouragement cards for struggles she had worried I might be facing. She had maintained a connection with me in her heart, even without any knowledge of my actual life. "I always wondered if you were happy," she said, pulling out a card she had written for my 21st birthday. "I worried that you might feel abandoned or unloved. I prayed that Margaret and David were good parents, and that you knew how much I cared about you, even though I couldn't be part of your life." Reading those unsent cards was like glimpsing an alternate version of my childhood where Jennifer had been present in some way. Her words revealed a mother's love that had persisted across decades and distance, a connection that had never been severed despite the physical separation. It was heartbreaking and healing at the same time. Before I left that evening, Jennifer gave me copies of all the letters and cards, along with a family tree showing my biological relatives on both sides. She also gave me her grandmother's address and phone number, encouraging me to reach out to my biological great-grandmother, who had been hoping to meet me for 28 years. The drive home to Riverside was emotional and reflective. I had gained a new family while simultaneously deepening my understanding of the family that had raised me. Jennifer's love and Margaret's love were different, but equally real, and I was beginning to see how both had shaped the person I had become. Over the following months, I developed relationships with my extended biological family while working to rebuild trust with Margaret and David. My biological grandmother, Ruth Collins, was everything I had hoped she would be, warm and wise and eager to share family stories that helped me understand my heritage. My aunts and uncles welcomed me into family gatherings, treating me as if I had always been part of their lives. Ryan eventually found the courage to tell his wife about me, and after some initial difficulties, we began exchanging emails and occasional phone calls. He was more reserved than Jennifer, but clearly cared deeply about my well-being and was proud of the woman I had become. The most surprising development was how my relationship with Margaret and David evolved through this process. Instead of feeling threatened by my connection with my biological family, they began to see Jennifer and Ryan as partners in my upbringing, rather than competitors for my affection. Margaret even sent Jennifer a thank you card, expressing gratitude for the sacrifice she had made that allowed them to raise me. "We all love Sarah," Margaret wrote in the card that Jennifer later showed me. "Maybe together we can give her the complete sense of family she deserves." 6 months after that life-changing Christmas dinner, I hosted a gathering at my apartment that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Margaret and David sat at the same table as Jennifer and David Kim, sharing stories about my childhood and comparing notes about my personality quirks and achievements. My half-siblings peppered my adoptive parents with questions about my teenage years, while Margaret showed Jennifer photographs from my high school graduation. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments of awkwardness as two families navigated their shared connection to me. But it was real in a way that my life had never felt before. For the first time, all the people who loved me were in the same room, acknowledging each other's importance in my story. Elena, who had been my support throughout this entire journey, watched the gathering with tears in her eyes. "Look at you," she said quietly. "You're exactly who you were always meant to be, but now you know why." The truth about my adoption had initially felt like a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about myself. But ultimately, it had led me to a more complete understanding of who I was and where I belonged. I wasn't just Sarah Mitchell, the perfect daughter who had achieved everything expected of her. I wasn't just Sarah Collins, the child who had been loved enough to be given opportunities her young parents couldn't provide. I was both and neither, and something entirely new, a woman who had been shaped by multiple families and multiple forms of love. The beach house that had once been my sanctuary became a place where all my families could gather. Margaret would arrive with elaborate picnic baskets, while Jennifer brought homemade cookies that reminded me of my childhood favorites. My half-siblings taught me card games, while my adoptive parents shared embarrassing stories about my piano recitals. David Kim would discuss business with my father David, while the two women who had mothered me discovered they had more in common than their shared love for me. Standing on my deck one evening, watching the sunset with people who represented every chapter of my story, I realized that the Christmas dinner revelation that had initially shattered my world had actually completed it. I had spent 28 years feeling like something was missing without knowing what it was. Now I understood that what had been missing wasn't a different family or a different life, but simply the truth about the one I had. The journey had been painful and complicated, full of difficult conversations and emotional reckonings. But it had led me to a place where I could love and be loved authentically, where my identity was built on truth rather than carefully maintained fiction. And that, I realized, was worth everything I had gone through to find it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.